Hello, everyone. Today we're going to talk about the Reagan Revolution, so basically the 1980s. So if you would like to follow along, just download the Reagan Revolution PowerPoint. Okay, so far, all of these presidents we've kind of talked about generally have believed in some form of containment. The Cold War is about containing the Soviet Union, not being too confrontational. To be sure, some of these presidents did confront the Soviets during the Cold War. Harry Truman was willing to go to Korea, Eisenhower with his brinkmanship, certainly Vietnam. But those were kind of proxy wars. They're not seen as direct confrontations necessarily with the Soviet Union. Reagan is going to be a little bit different. He's going to be more confrontational towards kind of the source, I guess you could say, of what he saw as evil in the world, the Soviet Union. He does call them an evil empire. Now, if you look at slide 3, basically, there's trends in American politics. From the Civil War until the Great Depression, Republicans tended to dominate national politics. Um, from the Civil War up until the Great Depression, there's only two Democrat presidents, Grover Cleveland and Woodrow Wilson. But then from the Great Depression until the 1980s, Democrats tend to dominate national politics. And even though the Republicans kind of make a rise in the 1980s, surely they did before in the 60s and 70s, but even during the 1980s and 90s, Democrats still control a lot of the states. They control the House of Representatives a lot of times. So just because we kind of have this rise of the right and Ronald Reagan, don't think that it's the Democrats go away. The Republicans seemed to go away during the Great Depression era. The Democrats seemed to go away kind of after the Civil War, as far as their ability to win national elections, but the Republicans, the rise of the new right, they're not quite as dominant as these previous two eras. A little bit about Reagan's background. He's born in Illinois in 1911. His father was an alcoholic. He moved the family around a lot. Reagan talked about how he had memories of his dad just kind of being passed out drunk, and that really turned Reagan off. They moved to Dixon, Illinois in 1920. A young Reagan becomes a lifeguard at the local river. He used to have a log where every time he would go out and have to save someone or kind of assist them when they were swimming, maybe they were going to drown, maybe they weren't, but they needed help. He put a little notch in this log. I think there's something like 70 some notches there. He later attends Eureka College and goes to work for WOC Radio. After college, he goes to Hollywood in the 1930s. He becomes an actor. From what I can tell from his background, he doesn't feel the pinch of the Depression as hard as a lot of people. Not everyone had it rough during the Depression. And, he didn't have a glamorous lifestyle, but, he's not one of these people that has his pockets out and is hitchhiking everywhere. He goes to Hollywood, becomes an actor, falls in love, marries an actress named Jane Wyman. If you've ever seen the movie The Yearling with Gregory Peck, she plays the wife of Gregory Peck. Reagan is a liberal Democrat. He votes for FDR all 4 times. FDR runs for president. So it's kind of surprising that Reagan becomes kind of the Republican hero of the 1980s. But Reagan always famously said, I didn't leave the Democrat Party. The Democrat Party left me. He says the Democrats get too radical. The 60s and 70s, the Vietnam War era, does kind of radicalize the Democrat Party, and they start doing a lot of things that probably even FDR would have opposed. While he's an actor in Hollywood, he has run-ins with communists. There are a lot of communists in the film industry. They have a presence in the film unions. He doesn't like their tactics. When he opposes some of the union stuff going on, there are people that call him on the phone and threaten to throw acid in his face and ruin his career. He gets threats against his life. Reagan talked about how he sleeps with a pistol next to his bed. So basically, Hollywood introduces him to the communists, and he realizes they do their dirty deeds in secret. They kind of have a secretive way of coming to power or kind of pushing their ideas. Reagan thinks if you're not willing to share your ideas out in the open, you kind of do it in a subversive way, something must be wrong with you. So like when the Hollywood 10, these are some Hollywood directors that have communist sympathies or are accused of having such sympathies. Reagan kind of testifies about communism in the film industry. That kind of drives a wedge between him and his wife, and they end up getting a divorce. Reagan ends up going to work for General Electric later on. He works on the radio. He does a radio program every week. He says that's when he realized that big government was the problem. So he kind of has an epiphany. Small government is the solution to most of our problems, not kind of FDR's big government. He eventually falls in love and marries Nancy Davis. That would be his wife when he becomes president. If you look at slides 5 and 6, I got some pictures of him and his marriage up here. So you can kind of see what he was like as a young person. In the 1964 election, remember how we talked about Barry Goldwater getting trounced? Reagan gives a speech supporting Barry Goldwater. It's called Reagan's Time for Choosing speech. If you want to watch it, I've got a clip here. And if you watch it, you'll kind of get a sense. Here's a guy who knows what he believes. He's articulate. You know, he's an actor. Even if he's only a B list actor, he's still an actor. He's handsome. He's well spoken. He knows what he believes. He has moral conviction. He can get a lot of people to kind of believe in what he believes. So even though Barry Goldwater gets trounced, Ronald Reagan gets catapulted to the national spotlight. He runs for the governorship of California a couple times against a popular incumbent. He wins. He clashes with the youth culture in California. Berkeley students, they lead a student strike. Reagan sends in, the police to kind of break this strike. Reagan is kind of seen as willing to go toe-to-toe with the student radicals of the day, and this makes him popular kind of with the silent majority. Reagan said, "I believe that where any group's rights are being imposed upon or any individual's rights by any others, it is the obligation of government to protect those constitutional rights at the point of the bayonet if necessary." So like Reagan says, government's job is to protect the rights that you have, not rights you have from government, just rights you have from nature, from God. It's government's job to protect those rights. It's not government's job to redefine those rights or to make life fair or to make sure, there's not too many rich people or the income gap is small. It's just to secure your rights. People start floating the idea of Reagan for president in the 1970s. Reagan does run for the Republican nomination in 1976. But he's defeated by Gerald Ford. And if you look at slide 11, I've got a picture up. Gerald Ford is up on stage. He's won the nomination to run against Jimmy Carter in 1976. And Gerald Ford is kind of giving a speech, and he recognizes that he needs to unite the moderate and conservative wings of the Republican Party. So he basically gives kind of a shout out to Reagan, and the whole place won't shut up. They keep clapping, they cheer. They just won't leave Reagan alone. Reagan is way more popular at the convention, it seems like, than Gerald Ford. Reagan comes down on stage and kind of the two shake hands and go forward. So Reagan doesn't get a chance to run in 76, but he will in 1980. And Reagan probably wouldn't have been possible without the rise of conservatism. Historians kind of call this the rise of the new right. They're worried about the size of government. They're worried about all the student radicals that seem to be kind of let loose on America's campuses. They're worried about communism. They're worried about, feminism. Feminism is kind of a new movement in American society. They're kind of worried about that. So Reagan, the new right, they kind of see big government, the Soviet Union, kind of communist tendencies or philosophies as the greatest threats to American liberty. And I won't tell you every person on the new right, but there's some people on the new right. If you look at slide 13, you've got intellectuals and think tanks. William F. Buckley is probably the most famous conservative intellectual. He starts a magazine called National Review. He also has a TV show called Firing Line, where he invites liberals, conservatives, anybody on, and they just talk policy. It's very slow TV, I guess you could say, but it's also very well informed TV. It's very to the point. It's very philosophical. It's not necessarily just politics where you get on and say talking points and someone else says talking points. It's actually a good debate. Milton Friedman, he's a Nobel Prize winning economist, kind of a libertarian style conservative. You have the Heritage Foundation, the American Enterprise Institute. These are think tanks. You have a group called neoconservatives. They're intellectuals who used to be liberal, but because of the Cold War, they become conservative. In the 70s and 80s, you kind of have the Cold War consensus breaking up. The Cold War consensus was this idea that Democrats and Republicans, liberals, conservatives, all agree that the Soviet Union is a threat and we have to fight them and oppose them. But because the Vietnam War happens, you basically have a split within the Democrat or kind of the liberal party or liberal wing of American society. Part of the liberals still believe the Cold War should be fought, but these new kind of liberals, these new Democrats, they basically say no, communism's not the biggest threat. It's kind of warmongering by the American, government, stuff like that. So like Gene Kirkpatrick, Nathan Glazer, Norman Podhoretz, these are kind of famous neoconservatives. There's conservatives that help conservative ideas through their organizational skills. Richard Viguerie, he applies computer technology to campaigning. He creates mailing lists, raises a ton of money for Republican conservative candidates. Even liberal Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, he says the GOP has become the party of ideas. And basically, during the 70s and 80s, you kind of get to the point where liberalism is established on the college campuses, and conservatism kind of becomes kind of the counterculture. You also have the rise of the new right, the religious right. Abortion becomes legal in the 1970s. Divorce rates are skyrocketing. You have kind of radical feminism. You have more push for homosexuality or homosexual rights in American society. So you have kind of this rise of kind of a conservative religious movement that gets called the religious right. Pat Roberts of the 700 Club, he's probably one of the most famous. But Jerry Falwell and the Moral Majority, they're probably the most famous. He's probably the most famous of the religious right that kind of mobilizes the Christian community to vote for conservative Republicans. So that stuff is kind of going on in the backdrop of American society. Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan run against each other in 1980. And if you think about it, the United States has undergone a lot. The Vietnam War, the protests that go with that, all the death, changing values. You have Watergate. Americans don't really trust their government anymore after the Vietnam War and Watergate. There's all kinds of assassinations. John F. Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King Jr. are assassinated. You have inflation. There's an Iranian hostage crisis where the American embassy is stormed by Iranian students and they take over 50 Americans hostage. Basically, America is kind of at a low point as far as its morale. But Ronald Reagan, he has a very optimistic personality. He says, this is the greatest country in the world. We have the talent, we have the drive. All we need is the leadership. And if you look at slide 17 and you watch that video clip, this is him announcing he's going to run for president. And you can kind of see his optimistic personality in the way he talks. And then if you look at slide 18, you see the election results. Jimmy Carter wins his home state of Georgia. He wins West Virginia, Maryland, Washington, D.C., and Minnesota, and Rhode Island. But everything else goes for Reagan. Reagan wins a landslide. He wins 90% of the electoral vote. He wins just over 50% of the popular vote. Now, basically, Reagan's philosophy is government is too big, Americans are taxed too much, the Soviet Union must be defeated. So those are kind of what guides his policymaking during his 8 years in office. He's an advocate of supply-side economics. Basically, the idea that economic growth comes from tax cuts, which will be invested as capital. So kind of the conservative belief is if you cut taxes, that stimulates the economy and more spending occurs. And when you actually have more spending, then you have more things to tax. So you actually make up those tax cuts with more tax revenue later on. Basically, the idea that investment will spur growth. Reagan gets his tax plan passed. It's called the Economic Recovery Tax Act. It lowers taxes. Now, the economy does have a recession in the early years of his presidency, 1981 and 1982. Basically, a lot of people don't think Reagan's going to win a second term in 1984. Reagan is worried that the economy is going to hurt his military buildup. Reagan believes that by building up the military, he can crush the Soviet Union. He thinks the Soviet Union is kind of an empty shell. They might look tough from the outside, but on the inside, their economy is in shambles. Their people have low morale. Basically, if we could press them really hard, force them to try to keep up their military spending with us, they'll eventually collapse. So he's worried that if we have economic troubles at home, his military won't get the money it needs, and then it won't be able to kind of bring the Soviet Union down. Um, so that's basically what Reagan's worried about. This whole kind of process is kind of called peace through strength. One of the things he does is called Star Wars. That's the nickname it gets, kind of the nickname that people use to make fun of it. It's actually called the Strategic Defense Initiative. Reagan says, what if we could put satellites up in space that would allow us to shoot down any missile that's shot at us? Basically, we would create a protective shield around the United States. Then the Soviet Union would never be able to attack us with nuclear weapons. So this is kind of labeled Star Wars. There's no way the technology is quite ready for this, but nobody really knows if this is possible or not. At least if you try it, think about putting a man on the moon. That's a big deal. It seems impossible at first, but hey, it was accomplished. So Reagan says, who knows? Reagan, unlike the rest of the presidents, he wants to actually press the Cold War and bring it to an end. He doesn't like détente, kind of that idea of cooling off of tensions. Let's relax the Cold War. Reagan famously says détente is what a farmer and a turkey have until Thanksgiving. So basically, the farmer and the turkey get along fine, but then when Thanksgiving comes, it's time for the turkey to be killed by the farmer. He says that's kind of how the Cold War is. We don't want to be in that situation where when the time comes, the Soviet Union can harm us. So Reagan helps ratchet up the rhetoric of the Cold War. He helps those in Europe that oppose the Soviet Union. There's a political movement, a trade unionist movement in Poland called Solidarity. He helps them. He helps the Afghans fighting the Soviets when the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan. He helps the Contras in Nicaragua. They're trying to overthrow the Sandinistas. Reagan calls the Soviet Union an evil empire. If you click on slide 23 on that YouTube link, you'll see him refer to the Soviet Union as an evil empire. Previous presidents would kind of watch, especially after Nixon and détente, presidents would kind of watch what they said. But despite all of this, the economy rebounds. The American people like Reagan, and he runs in 1984, and he runs against Walter Mondale, and only Washington, D.C. and Minnesota vote against Reagan. The rest of the country wins, so he gets a 49-state landslide. He does have some scandals later on in his presidency. The Iran-Contra affair. Basically, Reagan has been giving weapons to the Contras in Nicaragua. They're the anti-communists fighting the Sandinistas. Congress outlaws this. Congress is worried that we'll get dragged into another Vietnam, this time in Latin America. So Congress, kind of after the Vietnam Nixon era, Congress gains back a lot of its powers. But what Reagan does, and Reagan probably knew, but I think officially it's always kind of stated that he didn't know that this was going on. But what ends up happening is his administration sells weapons to Iran and then uses the money to fund the Contras. So they're kind of trying to get around Congress. So he does have his scandals. Eventually, what allows Reagan to end the Cold War is he has a good counterpart in Moscow. Mikhail Gorbachev comes to power. He's a new kind of Soviet leader. He's still a communist, but he's more willing to kind of talk with Reagan. He's kind of like the Khrushchev of his era, I guess you could say, but not quite as exciting of a personality. Gorbachev pushes for glasnost and perestroika, basically openness and reform or restructuring. So basically, the people in the Soviet Union aren't as afraid anymore. You can watch YouTube videos where people will talk with Gorbachev in public and criticize communism or say, the Soviet government is not taking care of the people, and Gorbachev will listen to them. Well, nobody ever would have done that to Stalin, otherwise they would have disappeared, their whole family would have died. So the Soviet Union has opened up a lot. Reagan and Gorbachev meet in 1985 in Geneva. They get to know each other, and basically they kind of build a friendship that allows the Cold War to come to an end. Later on, they meet in Reykjavik in Iceland. They have a summit there. Uh, Gorbachev needs an arms agreement. He's kind of facing a lot of political pressure at home. Reagan wants to work with him, but Gorbachev wants him to kill his SDI initiative, and Reagan says no, and this is kind of a turning point. And you're going to watch some videos kind of how the Cold War ended, but basically Reagan and Gorbachev, I think, kind of helped bring the Cold War to an end. I think it was their personalities. I also think the Cold War had kind of run its course, and it was the right time in history. Enough people in Europe were demanding change. People in the Soviet countries in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union were demanding change. They were putting pressure on their leaders to open up. Everyone knew that capitalism is better than socialism and communism. They saw that in West and East Berlin and Western Europe versus Eastern Europe. And what ends up happening is the Berlin Wall comes down in 1989, and then in 1991, the Soviet Union disintegrates, and basically you have the breakup of the Soviet Union. East Germany does away with communism. Later on, East Germany and West Germany will unite, and you'll have a unified Germany. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, Romania get rid of communism. Albania and Yugoslavia do. Most of the ending of the Cold War is peaceful. In Romania, it's pretty violent. When you watch the videos, you'll kind of see, but Nicolae Ceausescu, the leader of Romania, he actually gets hunted down and executed at the end of the Cold War. There's an attempt to overthrow communism in China at the Tiananmen Square protests. The Chinese ruthlessly crack down on this and end any thought that democracy will be allowed to happen in China. So basically, at the end of the Cold War, you have China, North Korea, and Cuba kind of as the major communist powers. Vietnam is still there, but not as much so. So the Cold War comes to an end peacefully for the most part, and you kind of have, kind of the end of this epic struggle for the last, 50 or so years. So that's kind of the end. That's kind of where we'll stop the class, just because we get into the 1990s, and that's kind of not so much modern day as it used to be, but it's still kind of the modern era. So that's kind of where we run out of time. So thanks for watching.